Hello, hi, good evening. So I am Krishnaveni. So we are on this journey talking about the story of life. So we have been discussing a lot of stories, that is your biology. So on Monday, Wednesday and Friday, I teach for class 12, and for the remaining 3 days, I teach for class 11. So good evening, Naveen. So I believe it's raining in your place. So you have given me that smiley. Okay, so please stay safe. Both your rains and your corona, both are dangerous. So stay safe. Okay, fine. So thank you all of those who have joined my journey today. So we are here on lecture 2 talking about evolutionary biology. So it was a pretty normal story, right? So where we spoke about how life came into existence. Good evening, Patil. So again, thank you for joining me. Fine. So how life existed on earth, so how first your universe began, so how it expanded, so what actually happened, so what was the first living organism, how did they come to find out this, so all that was being discussed. So good evening, yes, okay. So now we'll take off from there. So today we're going to we'll try to complete this chapter because we don't have much. So we just have few definitions and one important principle, that is your Hardy-Weinberg principle. So we might finish the chapter today. So before we actually go into today's chapter, so it's again a gentle reminder, so please download eCareerPoint app so you can find my PPTs in your PDF format. And if at all you want to purchase any course or product, so please use my coupon code. And mind you, it is valid only till 30th November and we're not very far away from it. So now, going on to today's agenda, so what we'll be talking. Okay, so this is what we were talking. So we were talking about evolution. So this is the first picture that comes into your mind when you talk about evolution, right? Fine. So what evolution has to tell us? So this is exactly our agenda. So we're going to talk about the origin of life. We've already discussed how it started. So we started from looking at your stars and how things came into picture. We spoke about your Big Bang theory. So what was Big Bang theory? I told you it is a unimaginable explosion, right? So it is one of the theory that is held today to explain the evolution of your universe. So it basically works on the collision of your universe, which was under a very high temperature condition. So that is called as a Big Bang, and it works on true principles. So your first principle was it works on your Einstein's theory of relativity, and second is called the cosmology's principle. So what do I mean by cosmology's principle is neither it depends on the direction in which you look nor on your location. So that is Big Bang theory. So you have observations which act as evidence for that theory, but we still don't know what exactly was Big Bang theory because no one ever saw it, so we don't have any eyewitness. So good evening, Ashraful. Then we spoke about the evolution of life forms. So which first came into being? So we spoke about the theory of your panspermia, then you had Louis Pasteur, then you had spontaneous theory of generation. And then people said, okay, so life comes from pre-existing cells. Okay, but where exactly life starts? Then you had Oparin and Handlin who said it comes from chemical evolution. Then you had Miller working on experiments. So he mimicked the exact conditions in lab and understood that, okay, amino acids are being formed, sugars are being formed, polysaccharides are being formed. Yes, Patil, it is panspermia. So we spoke about all that. So that was the evolution of life forms. So that is what we spoke about. Then we spoke about evidence for evolution. So quickly recapitulating what are the evidence that we spoke for evolution. The first one was your paleontological evolution. So we spoke about your fossils. So how fossils can be one strong evidence. Then we went on to speak about your embryological evidence. Then we spoke about your convergent and divergent evolution. So what was your convergent? What was your divergent? So your divergent are the ones which had similar structures but different functions, and your convergent was the opposite. Though they look alike, they have different functions. Your example for your convergent evolution is your flippers of your penguin and your dolphin, etc. Right? I guess we stopped there. And we also spoke about one of the evidence for your natural selection. So what was that evidence for your natural selection? We spoke about the moth, right? So you had the white moth and the brown moth, and then we spoke about how natural selection supported the life of a particular moth. So that is where we stopped. So today we go from there. So the first thing today that we'll talk about is adaptive radiation. So, and then we'll go ahead with biological evolution. So what exactly is biological evolution? Then the mechanism for biological evolution. Then we'll talk about Hardy-Weinberg principle. And finally, we'll talk about the evolution of man. So in talking from NEET point of view, your Hardy-Weinberg principle is where you get some questions. So you might feel Hardy-Weinberg principle is one tricky area here. But as we go and look forward, we'll make it as simple as possible. And I will try to explain. So if you have any doubts or any questions regarding this chapter, so make sure you put it in the chat box. Okay, so now going forward and talking about adaptive radiation. So what do you mean by adaptive radiation? What exactly happens? So adaptive radiation. So you have a particular organism and it adapts according to the surroundings. So that can be one literal meaning that you can pull out from the term, right? But let me tell you, your Charles Darwin was the hero here. He was the scientist who was working on your evolution, right? So he was the person who was the naturalist who gave us so many theories. So he spoke about the fittest of the survival. So he gave us conclusions. So if you remember my previous lecture, so I was telling you he gave us conclusions. So he was a naturalist who came up with the theory of fitness or survival of the fittest, right? So now again, talking about adaptive radiation. So your Charles Darwin, when he was on his journey to Galapagos Islands, so he found out or he found a very rich diversity in that island. So what particularly caught his eye was a particular kind of species, and though they were nothing but black birds. So he called them, later now we call them as Darwin's finches, but he was particularly very fascinated by this bird. So what exactly are these birds is like, they are actually the original birds were your seed eating birds, but later these birds, he found out, they had various adaptations. In a particular island, a particular species of a bird had so many adaptations. For example, the original black finches, they were adapted to have seeds. The later ones that further adapted were able to eat insects. So from the original seed eating to the insectivores, there was a quick adaptation on the same island. He was really fascinated looking at this. So hence he gave birth to the term that is called adaptive radiation. So what exactly or how do you define adaptive radiation? So it is the process of evolution of different species in a given geographical area, starting from a point and literally radiating towards other areas. So what does this complex term mean? So you have a particular species here, okay, on a particular island, and in that particular island only you have the adaptation of that species itself. So as you have various adaptation of that particular species, it goes on to different geographical areas. So from one particular geographical area, it gets adapted and it moves on to different geographical area. So that is called as adaptive radiation. Fine, you get what adaptive radiation means? So the example for adaptive radiation is your Darwin's finches and your Australian marsupials. So Darwin's finches were the ones observed by your Darwin, and then Austrian marsupials were also examples for adaptive radiation because on a particular island. So this adaptation on a particular island was speculated by Darwin. So no one had any evidence that they were actually from that particular island, but it was an observation from his conclusion. Okay, so this is how your Darwin's finches were adopted. So there were so many different varieties of a same bird on a particular island. So that is called as adaptive radiation. So this is about Darwin's finches, and then you had marsupials. Okay, so Australian marsupials were also examples of your adaptive radiation. So talking further about your adaptive radiation. So when you have more than one adaptive radiation, for example, in a particular area, so if you have either Darwin's finches or Australian marsupials, so you have more than one, right? So when you have more than one adaptive radiation, you can call it as a convergent evolution. So what do you mean by convergent evolution? So from this point, they are getting radiated, right? So from that, it is spreading. So it is a convergent evolution. So this is also an example of your convergent evolution. So another example, that is your placental mammals. So what do I mean by placental mammals? They are again a group of endangered species from in whose fetus you can find the first layer of placenta in a relatively later stage of development. So those are placental mammals. So placental mammals, they are found particularly in Australia. So they exhibit adaptive radiation into evolving varieties of these placental mammals. So for example, when I show you the figure, it will be easy. So this is your Tasmanian wolf, and then you have a placental wolf, okay. So they also show adaptive radiation because that is more than one adaptive radiation is happening. So this is called as convergent evolution. Are the terms clear? What is convergent evolution? We also spoke about your convergent evolution when we are talking about the evidence of your evolution. So literally it means the same if you understand the trick behind it. So what do you mean by adaptive radiation? When you have more than um, one original variation, right? So originally it was like this, and then you had so many variation on a particular island, so that is called adaptive radiation. So on a particular geographical area, if you have more, when it represents more habitat, for example, when you take the geographical location of India, so India is richly diverse from your Jammu and Kashmir till your Kanyakumari. So your geographical, your diversity will also be so expanded, so vast, right? So similarly, when you talk about a particular geographic area, I mean it represents various habitat. So in such a kind of habitat, when you have more than one adaptive radiation, it is called as convergent evolution. Okay? Okay, Patel, so you understood? So that is well and good. So now, we are going into what is your biological evolution. So evolution by natural selection. So this evolution, natural selection were the terms that we kept on talking again and again, right? So what was natural selection? When nature supports your growth. So for that you have to be fit enough. So what was the fitness that we were talking about in the previous class? The fitness that we were talking about was in terms of evolution tells us the natural selection or concludes that is called as the natural selection. Fine? Okay. So this is more important. So this is the point that I want to talk under biological evolution. So what exactly is biological evolution? So the rate of appearance of new forms, okay, a link to life cycle of a particular organism. So someone's asking me, you're studying only 12th, not 11th. So I told you I teach for class 12 on Monday, Wednesday and Friday. And for the remaining 3 days, that is Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday, I teach for class 11. Okay, so if you have any particular topic that you want me to teach, so please put it on the comment section so that I will know which topic you're expecting me to teach. So coming back here, so this point is pretty important. The rate of appearance of new forms is linked to the life cycle or lifespan. So one example that I want to give you here is microbes. For example, consider there is a population A. So you have a group of microorganisms that is called as population A. You have another group which is called as B. So how fast your bacteria can reproduce? So it will just take 20 minutes for your E. coli to replicate. So within an hour, your bacteria can produce millions of populations, right? It can reproduce and it can increase its progeny to a wider level. So in such a short span of time. So how do you grow bacteria? So you grow them on a particular medium. So your bacteria has an inbuilt mechanism to utilize that medium that you have given. Okay, your bacteria needs food, right? So when you're artificially growing bacteria, you provide them with the food. So that is called as a medium. So the medium on which you grow bacteria, so your bacteria has an inbuilt ability to know how to utilize that feed, okay? So that is population A. Now your population A is growing pretty quickly, everything is fine. So your population A is surviving under normal conditions. Then in case of population B, so what happens, suppose if you change the medium. So at a time you are growing population A and population B, fine. So under normal conditions, your population A grows fast. But if you change the medium in which you are growing population A, okay, now your B has the ability to utilize your medium, the changed medium. Now the population of A will decrease and your B will increase, right? So that is ultimately natural selection. So the ability of you to survive at the given condition is called natural selection. Now your population B will survive, right? So your population B will outsmart your population of A. So what I am trying to say is natural selection is heritable, so it causes variations, okay? And your fitness is the end result of your natural selection and your ability to adapt to a particular point. So in case of bacteria, it is just a matter of an hour. In a matter of an hour, it will produce so many progenies. So it is because it happens in an hour because the life cycle is very small. If the same has to happen between two population of fishes or two population of other organisms whose lifespan is very, very long, it is not possible. Here the reproduction, the rate of reproduction is only very less, okay? So it just takes 20 minutes for a bacteria to replicate and produce progeny. So in that case, the lifespan of the organism itself is less. So the rate at which it can do natural selection and it can undergo fitness process is very quick. But the same process when it happens in fishes, it takes millions of years. So what is the lifespan of a fish? So do you have any idea what is the lifespan of a fish? Okay, so you want me to start with plant physiology? Okay, so I will consider. So I will start with plant physiology. Okay. So in case of a fish, so you have fishes which can live up to 3-5 years. So you have some fishes like carps which can live up to 30 years, and you have catfishes which can live up to 60 years. So in case of those organisms whose lifespan is pretty long, so this natural selection will also take a much longer time. So the rate of appearance of new forms is actually linked to the life cycle or the lifespan of an organism. Yes, so you also have some fishes which can live up to 40 years. So it depends on the breed of the fish, the type of fish that you're talking about. So that is what I want to put a point. So if the organism has an increased lifespan, so the ability of the natural selection to select the fittest will take a long time. In case of bacteria, suppose if you have changed the medium, population B survives better than population A. So for natural selection to select the fittest, it will not take much time because the lifespan of the organism itself is less. So do you get my point? So what do I mean by biological evolution? Okay. So now going forward, so nature selects for fitness. So that's what I want to tell you. So your fitness is based on the characters that you inherit. So when I talk about characters and inheritance, so it is understood that I have a genetic basis working here. So coming again to the first point, nature selects for fitness. Only the organisms that can survive pretty well, that can reproduce and increase the progeny is selected by nature, is preferred by nature. Okay, so those organisms are called fit organisms, or the aspect that we're talking about is fitness. So I say your fitness is based on the characters that you inherit. When I talk about characters and inheritance, it is understood that I am talking on a genetic level. So at the back screen, what works is your genetic basis. So now your genetic basis is getting selected and evolved. So your genetic basis is very essential for you to get naturally selected and to evolve. Understood? So adaptive ability is inherited, and finally your fitness is the end result. So it is just playing with English. You just need to remember 3 terms. First is nature, fitness, and that fitness has a genetic basis. So what are you trying to inherit? Here is your ability to adapt. That is all. So it is just playing with English. I have given you sentences from your NCERT book. So that you understand what each sentence means. So ultimately it says, fitness is important and the organisms which are fit are selected by your natural selection. So what is the backdrop or what is the driving force of your fitness is the characters that you inherit. So when I talk about characters and inheritance, we go back to genetics, right? So here you have a genetic basis on which your characters are inherited, and those characters are responsible for the fitness that is the end result of your natural selection. Fine? So this is all I want you to understand. Yes, for example, this picture gives us a beautiful example. So you have 2 types of worms, you can say, or beetles. So you have red and green. So your crows find your green beetles very tasty. So your green beetles tend to be finished off quickly or they get exhausted. What survives here is your red beetle. So here the characters that is inherited, its ability to adapt. So finally fitness is the end result of natural selection. So this is what I want to tell you or convey you at the end. Okay. So now going forward, again, branching descent. So branching descent is nothing but talking about your adaptive radiation and your natural selection. So these 2 were the key for your Darwinian theory of evolution. So according to evolution, your main player here is your Charles Darwin. So according to his theory, you have 2 key factors. One is your branching descent and one is your natural selection. Fine. So apart from even before actually Charles Darwin came into the picture, or even before we came to know about Charles Darwin, there was another French naturalist. His name was Lamarck. So I guess everyone knew about Lamarck because he gave us a theory of giraffe. The giraffe felt the need for a longer neck, and hence in subsequent generation he said that it got a longer neck. So he told the evolution of life occurred, and the driving force behind it is the use or disuse of a particular organism. So he said for giraffes, in an attempt to forage leaves in a tall plant, it was acquiring for a long neck. Okay. So later in its lifestyle, he said it acquired that character. So as generation passed on, he concluded that this acquired character became an inherent quality and hence the giraffe had a tall neck. So now this theory is no longer valid, but that is what he told us. That is what Lamarck told us, but this was proved wrong. Fine. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the question still remains, is evolution a process or it is the consequence of a process? Sometimes you don't know whether it is the cause or the effect, right? So if you talk about cancer, you might not know. Sometimes cancer people will not only suffer from cancer, they will also have infection in the brain, infection in the ear, infection in the stomach. So you do not know which was the cause and which was the effect. Maybe because you had infection in the gut lining, it caused cancer, or because of cancer, you had the infection in the gut lining. So you don't know which is the cause or effect. Similarly, even in this process, at the end of the day, the question remains, is evolution actually a process or is it the result of a particular process happening? So this can be taken in two aspects. So it is how you see. So when you talk about a process, for example, when you talk about the surroundings as a whole, when you talk about living and non-living things, you assume evolution is a process. But at the same time, when you talk about the story of life on Earth, just like we are doing, how life forms evolved, how it happened, how that happened, then our conclusion is evolution is the result of a process. The evolution is a result of how the story of life on Earth became adaptable. So at the end of the day, you still can't distinguish between evolution as a process or the end of the process. So still we are confused. Okay, so that is the question that we are still trying to get into, but still we have not arrived at a particular conclusion. Fine, so this is what Lamarck told us. So going forward, mechanism of evolution. So before we actually go into mechanism of evolution, let me tell you there was another player. Here the other player was Thomas Malthus, okay. So he also did some work on population studies. So from him, Charles Darwin took some observation. So what Malthus told was, for example, a particular population is stable. Okay, a population size is stable except for seasonal changes. Might be according to the season, you might have some fluctuations. Otherwise, a population is stable and it is able to utilize the resource as normally as possible. So everything is fine. But at the same time, for example, when I say natural selection, fitness, when it comes into picture, so it is the ability of a particular group of population to utilize a particular resource, reproduce properly and increase its progeny. So when you have two particular groups and when I say they are utilizing the resource properly, I tend to say that there is a competition between the two population. So which among the two population will be selected by nature? The one which has a better ability to utilize the resource, the one which can reproduce more properly and increase its progeny, right? So ultimately, Darwin told us that it is the characters that you inherit. So it is those small variations that will cause your adaptability much efficient. So that was the conclusion at the end of the day Darwin told us. So also remember there's another scientist called as Thomas Malthus, who also worked on population studies. So based on his studies, your Charles Darwin took the observation. Fine. So now talking about the mechanism of evolution. So how it happened. So long we were discussing, arguing, okay, so life existed on Earth, how it started, etc. So we spoke about the types of radiations, I gave you examples, but how did it happen? So what was the process? Everything has a process, right? So just like you were born yesterday, you didn't come here studying for NEET. So you had your entire childhood, your teenage, everything happening. And then you are here right now. So how this mechanism of evolution happened? So what is that process? So the first thing, so what is the origin of this variation? So I was telling you, Charles Darwin said that fitness is the end result of natural selection and your characters are inherited. So what is the origin of this variation? So for example, when I say a population is stable, so it does not mean that all organisms are of clones, right? So you still have variations. When I say a human population, even in a human population, there are so many variations. You and I are not alike. We are so different. Even you and your siblings are not alike. Even twins are not exactly identical. So there is some variation happening. So variation gives rise to evolution, right? So that is what we have been talking about in meiosis as well. So your process of meiosis gives rise to variation and variation is essential for evolution. So that was the first point that we spoke about when we were talking about the significance of meiosis, right? Okay. But what is the origin of this variation? So where does this origin begin and how does speciation occur? So that is the first question. When Charles Darwin was working, Mendel was into picture, so Mendel's theory of inheritance was proved, but still Charles Darwin could not connect to Mendel's points. He said it is only that variations play a role. So then another scientist came into picture. His name was Hugo de Veris. He said mutation is what causes evolutions. So what are mutations? Large differences which are coming up suddenly in a population. So that is what was called mutation. At the time of Hugo de Veris, he said that mutation causes evolution and not small variations. So according to Charles Darwin, it was variation which causes evolution. But now you have another scientist saying it is your mutation which causes evolution. So how did he describe mutation? He called them as large examples which suddenly arises in a population. So that is what is called as mutation. And he also told your mutations are random and directionless. Whereas your Darwinian variations, the variations which Darwin spoke about are small and directional, and your evolution was gradual in case of your variations, okay? So this was the conclusion given. Hugo de Veris also said mutation caused variation. So for both the questions, he gave the answer. He said it is only mutation which causes speciation and it is mutation which causes evolution. Okay, so when you have mutation occurring one generation after the other and one species after the other, he called it saltation. So it is a single step large mutation. So you have so many species in a particular ecosystem. If mutation happens in all the species, so that is called as saltation. So this was the conclusion that we got. So this is the mechanism of evolution. Understood? Got it? Okay. So for example, if a particular microorganism, so do I have anything on the slide? Okay, so before going into Hardy-Weinberg's principle, let me tell you, for example, all of us carry mutation. So you and I also have a mutation, but that mutation will be selected at a particular time. So that is when it supports your adaptability. Our natural selection process will select that mutation. Bacteria, the rate of mutation that is happening in bacteria is high, because mutation also happens according to your lifespan. In bacteria, the rate of mutation is high. For example, artificially, if you inject a particular mutation or if you mutate a particular gene in a bacteria, it is very possible that in the very near generation, you will have the mutation happening. The mutation will become common. So the mutation will become the new evolution. But in case of humans, it is not the case, right? Because our lifespan is long and the rate of mutation and that to be selected by nature will take a long time. Okay, suppose if the bacteria has a very advantageous mutation and if that is selected by nature, it will give you new phenotype. So that resulted in speciation. For example, you have so many species of bacteria, right? So if one group of bacteria carries an advantageous mutation and if that mutation over time is selected by your natural selection, it gives rise to new phenotype. That is new characters, that is new organism. So that is what is leading to speciation. Fine? Understood? Okay. So this is all about your mechanism of evolution and how evolution happened. Now talking about the most important thing, that is your Hardy-Weinberg principle. So your Hardy-Weinberg principle essentially comes into your population genetics. So here we are going to talk about alleles and genes. So do you remember what an allele is and what a gene is? Because we have spoken about your molecular genetics and your Mendelian genetics. Now the point about your alleles and genes should be pretty clear. So going back and talking about what is a gene. So can you quickly define a gene for me? And can you quickly define an allele for me? So gene, okay, so allele, so Naveen says contrasting. Okay, I understand, that is right. So alleles are contrasting characters of a gene. So first thing, a gene is a sequence of your nucleotide that can code for a protein. So a gene is any sequence or of a polynucleotide or a nucleotide that codes for a protein that is called as a gene. So genes are also known as the unit of heredity. Fine. Now, how do you define allele? So one example I can give you. Say for example, this is gene A. Gene A codes for the character height. So this codes for the character height, meaning this is a sequence of polynucleotide. So at the end product, it will code for a protein which will determine the height of an organism. So what are the two types of contrasting characters for height? So what are the traits of height? So height can either determine tallness or dwarfness, right? So this is called a character, and thus contrasting options are called as traits. Fine. So if this is the gene that is coding for height, so it will have two contrasting options, right? It can either be tall or it can either be dwarf. So this contrasting or alternate forms of a gene, yes Patil, you're right, so that is called as allele. Now you understood these two basic terms. Now going back to the previous slide, and we'll see what Hardy-Weinberg has to tell us. So Hardy-Weinberg told us in a given population, okay, so alleles are located on the same position of homologous chromosome, okay, need not be. So you have tightly linked genes and loosely linked genes, so not necessarily. So you can just say your first option was right, so they are alternate forms of a gene, or you can say contrasting pairs of a gene, contrasting characters of a gene, that is also right, okay. So Hardy-Weinberg equation, or it says how it started. So one can find a frequency of occurrence of an allele of a gene or a locus, right? So in a given population, you can find the frequency of occurrence of a particular allele on a gene, right? So you have a population. So for example, if all of us are tall, so that frequency of that particular allele of that gene height can be found out, right? So you can predict that. So that is what he started with. So he said allele frequencies in a population are stable. So when you talk about a population, when you talk about a definite population, Hardy-Weinberg said the allele frequency in a population are stable and it is constant from generation to generation. So even after so many generations of mating, the frequency of that particular allele is still constant. So this is what Hardy-Weinberg proposed. So when your allele frequency is constant, further adding to the point, your gene pool. So what do I mean by gene pool? It is the total genes and their alleles in a population. So it is the mixture of everything. So that is called as a gene pool. So when your allele frequency can remain stable, it means your gene pool will also remain stable. Okay, so that was his conclusion. So he called this as genetic equilibrium. When the frequency of your allele is constant, which means you are at a genetic equilibrium. So your genetic equilibrium is also known as Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium because he gave what is called as a genetic equilibrium. Fine. So this is what he told us. Now, bringing your statistics into the picture, the sum total of all frequencies is 1. So this is what he concluded. And this is where you get equations. So what was the equation? So let me quickly go back. Okay. So for example, you have individual frequencies, right? So you have alleles. So alleles have alleles are a pair. So if you talk about the frequency, individual frequency, say you have two frequencies P and Q. So P is the frequency of your allele A and Q is the frequency of your allele small a. Now, what is the probability okay, now we are going to talk about the allele frequency in an individual having AA. So we are talking about the allele frequency here. If your individual frequencies are denoted by P and Q, now you connect that with alleles. So we have two alleles, one is capital A, the other one is small a. So if the frequency of capital A is P and if the frequency of small a is Q, now a person with AA allele, if a person with AA allele in his gene, so what will be his frequency? P square. So it is nothing but the sum of the frequencies, sum of the product of the frequencies. Now a person with AA will have frequency Q square, right? Now a person with AA, a heterozygous condition, will have 2PQ. So it is nothing but P plus Q the whole square, which is your binomial equation. So when you have genetic equilibrium maintained, this P square Q square 2PQ will be equal to 1 because there is no change in your frequency. So it will always remain a constant. So it is P square plus Q square plus 2PQ is equal to 1. So P square is the frequency of your individual with AA allele. Q square is the frequency of your individual with small a, which is your recessive character. This is your dominant character. Now, 2pq is your individual with heterozygous condition. So, you can say A small a. So, when you have the genetic equilibrium maintained, when you do not have any change in your allele frequency and when your gene pool remains constant, so this is equal to 1. So, that is what Hardy-Weinberg told us. Fine. So, now looking at this figure, you will understand. So, this is what he told us. So, now you understood where P and Q came from. So, P is your individual frequency, P and Q are how your individual frequencies are denoted. For example, when you talk about the allele capital A and the frequency of allele capital A is represented by Q. So, in an organism, we are diploid, right? So, we have a pair of alleles. So, when you have a pair of capital A alleles, so it is represented by P square, and when you have small a, it is represented by Q square. When your genetic equilibrium is maintained, when you do not have any change in your allele frequency or your gene pool, so this should be a constant, right? Because there is no change, so this has to be a constant. So, this is what your Hardy-Weinberg told us. So, this is called as your genetic equilibrium or your Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So, hello? Fine. So, understood what is Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium? So, how can questions come? So, even at a difficult level, so they will give you the frequency of A. So, this much you understood? So, if at all a numerical question has to come, how it will come? They will tell you the frequency P is say this person, frequency Q is this person. So, find whether it satisfies Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium or not. So, you have to understand what is individual frequency and what is a frequency of an individual having AA allele. So, individual frequency is P and Q, but when you talk about an individual having AA, it becomes P square. So, they will give you the numericals like this. So, it can be very simple. They will give you the value for P and Q. Then they will ask you to find if it satisfies Hardy-Weinberg condition. Even at a difficult level, only this much they will ask you. So, this is called as population genetics, and this is also very beautiful. For a given population, you can find if there is allele frequency happening or not. But now, everything is not so easy. Again, you have complication. So, you have particular factors affecting your Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So, what are those factors? So, your first known factor is your gene migration or your gene flow. So, what do I mean by gene migration? For example, when an Indian moves to a foreign country and when he has his generations there, so the gene gets mixed, so your genetic equilibrium is disturbed. So, in an American equilibrium, your Indian gene is getting mixed, so that is gene migration. So, when you have gene migration happening over generations, it is called as gene flow. And when this gene flow occurs by chance, it is called as genetic drift. Fine. Then you have mutation. Mutation is sudden change in your DNA sequence. Then it is genetic recombination. So, you have two different type of species mating together to give a genetically recombined one. So, that is genetic recombination. Finally, it is your natural selection which will act on all these factors. So, for your Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium to be equal to 1, for your genetic equilibrium to be maintained, all these factors should not affect. Right? Only if your gene does not move, then the allele frequency is the same. If your gene flow is there, if your gene migration is there, your allele frequency is different, right? Okay. So, that is what I want to tell you about Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So, it is in short called as HW equilibrium. Finally, you have what is called as founder's effect. So, when you have the original population starting or commencing a new population, that becomes your founder's effect. Okay. Your original population, they act as founder. So, that is called as founder's effect. Fine? Okay. So, now we are in the last topic of your evolutionary biology, that is your evolution. So, origin and evolution of man. So, where it all started. So, ultimately our objective is to know more about human beings, right? So, how did we come? Where did we come? What is our phylogeny? What are our ancestral linkages? So, that is what we have to find. So, we stopped with S.L. Miller finding out mimicking conditions similar conditions in the lab and finding that amino acids, sugars, polysaccharides formed. Before that, we had chemical evolution happening. So we understood that from acellular life forms, so somewhere in between we had cellular life forms coming into picture. But we don't know the exact mechanism, how it happened. So from cellular, so we understood you had cellular life forms as well. From then on, we understood we had single-celled organisms coming into picture. Then you slowly had invertebrates. So from invertebrates, we understood you had your fishes. So from fishes, over years, you had seaweeds and plants coming into picture. So seaweeds and plants. So from seaweeds and plants, then over years, when your fishes were able to survive on land, so over years, you had amphibians coming into picture. So that is how your process of evolution happened, right? So everything happened millions of years ago, slowly and gradually. So amphibians gave birth to reptiles. So they gave birth for the evolution of reptiles. So this is how your story goes on. First, it was your acellular organism. From there, somewhere we found out that, okay, cellular organism also comes into picture. So how exactly that mechanism we couldn't find. So then we understood you had single cell organisms that are living. So when we were talking in your biological classification, your archaebacteria are the primitive ones. They are called as progenate. So what do I mean by progenate? They're the last universal ancestors. No one was before them. So they're the last universal ancestors. So that is single cell organism. So from there, over millions of years, after millions of years, you had the evolution of invertebrates and then your fishes. Then fishes, slowly you had seaweeds and plants, then amphibians, then reptiles, so on and so forth, right? So I'm not discussing this. We'll just talk about the evolution of human beings. So about 15 million years ago, so MYA is million years ago. So you had two kinds. So one is Dryopithecus and Ramapithecus. So these were the two types. So what were they? So this is only about the evolution of man I'm discussing in detail. So they were hairy and walked like gorillas and chimpanzees, okay? So your Dryopithecus were more ape-like, okay? So they are more close relatives of your apes, and your Ramapithecus were more man-like. So that is where how evolution started for man, okay? So initially you had two categories, and this was about 15 million years ago. So it was your Dryopithecus and Ramapithecus. So they were mostly chimpanzee and gorilla-like, but Ramapithecus were more man-like, okay, so they were the forward successors, and your preceding ones were your Dryopithecus. The first human-like creatures were called as Homo habilis, okay, so they did hunting, they started ingesting food, so from that we classified them as Homo habilis. So after Homo habilis, so we started comparing the brain capacity. So how complex? So the brain capacity was pretty minimum, so 650 to 800 cc. Then the next form of human beings were called as Homo erectus. So man started thinking slowly. So he had a pretty large brain. So it was around 900 cc. So last, it was your Neanderthals. So they had a much high complex cognition senses. So the brain capacity was 1400. Fine. So then during the Ice Age, so which was pretty near compared to all the others, so you had your modern Homo sapiens coming into picture. So I have a quick picture of all of them. So this is your Dryopithecus, then you have your Ramapithecus, then your Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and finally your Homo sapiens. So this is the story of evolution of man. So slowly there were so many changes. So they started hunting, they started ingesting food, then they started thinking. So based on all that characters, this is how the evolution process happened. Fine. So since we have spoken so much about evolution, so let me talk about something that is recent and that happened in very recent times. So it says, so we spoke about Neanderthals, right? So Neanderthal genes raise the risk of serious COVID. So since we are in this pandemic, so I thought I will bring this into picture. So the recent finding says if you have the segment of a Neanderthal genes, because they are our recent relatives, right? So that gene causes a very serious risk or susceptibility to your COVID. So these were your Neanderthals. So a gene segment that arises the risk of your COVID-19, that gene was actually inherited from your Neanderthals. So you understand, right? There's a genetic basis behind evolution. So they are our near ancestors. So we might have some genes which have come from them. So when you have genes inherited from them, they say you're more susceptible to COVID-19 infection. So at present, the segment is carried by around 50% of the people of South Asian ancestry and 16% of your European backgrounds. Fine. So this gene in this region may have protected the Neanderthals in various other diseases, but now it is susceptible to your COVID-19. So this gene was also naturally selected, which means it had a particular unique feature, right? So it helped them survive in a particular pandemic, but right now it is very susceptible to your COVID-19 infection. Fine. So this was the recent finding. So I thought now you will be able to correlate. Fine. Okay, Vinayak, that's okay. I am good. Thank you. So how are you? Fine. So this is what I want to talk about. So your entire topic of evolution is over. So next I will solve questions related to your genetics. So that is more important, right? So your Mendelian genetics, your molecular genetics, and then your population genetics. So I will solve questions from all of these. So previous year questions. So when you talk about your Mendelian genetics, so you have complicated questions, right? So if your genotype is given, so how many gametes are formed? So if your gametes are given, so what can be the possible genotypes? So questions like these are confusing. So in one particular lecture, we will solve the questions. So if you really genuinely like the session, so please subscribe, like and share. So tell your friends. Yes, so everything is literally based on your genes. Whether you're happy, sad, you're satisfied, dissatisfied. So everything is based on your genes. You can simply blame your genes. So if at all you have any suggestion as to which chapter I should start, please let me know in the comment box. So I will consider your request. Okay, so hope you enjoyed my session and thank you for being such a good audience. So have a good evening. Yes, so thank you and take care. Bye.